Alright, so I'll try to make this a quick video as I realized over the years as I've been building my van engine and modifying things on it, I'm sure I left specs here and there, but I've never given a full rundown. But now that the long block and such is mostly built and, adding a few things, it's basically ready to be put into the truck, I thought that I would kind of talk about what it is, what modifications it has, and so on, where it all started. So, to start off, this is the original um, 5.0 out of my van. Obviously, the third generation Econolines had different engine options. There was a 5 liter, 5.8, the 351, a 460, and then the inline 6, which is like a 4.9, which technically a 5.0 is actually a 4.9, but now that this is a 306, it's actually a real 5.0. So, if you don't know about the Ford 302, it was actually born out of the Ford GT40, which after they dominated Ferrari with the 427, Le Mans had a displacement restriction for 5 liters. So Ford took the 289, they put it into a 302. They turned it into a 302, excuse me, changing the stroke. And then that engine was born and kind of became a legendary small block for Ford, which eventually came to the metric moniker of 5.0 by the 80s. And from there, that name became synonymous with Mustangs for a while. So, classic engine now. And it was my first engine out of an 88 Thunderbird. So I'm kind of happy to finally see one of these things built. I love small blocks. I love high winding engines, even though this is a truck engine and it's not exactly of that variety. But so getting right into it. So we'll start from the bottom up. We have the block was actually a machined block that I bought and had shipped from Texas. And that's actually stamped as like an 88 Thunderbird. So it's kind of cool because that was my first car. So who knows, maybe it's the engine out of my first car. You never know, right? So we started with that because it was machined. It came from an environment where there was not a lot of expansion and contrast of the weather. If it, stayed there, if it was technically a southern block, but it was a thought that I had. So that was machined. It was bored 30 over. So now instead of a 4-inch bore, it's a 4.0, a 30 thousandths, 4 and 30 thousandths bore. From there, it's just a standard oil pan. But I got a new one and it was a little, the casting was not quite like stock, but I'm also running a one-piece Moroso gasket with oil pan studs, so hopefully it doesn't drip too much, but whatever if it does, call it a Harley. I modified it with this is a temperature bung from Glow Shift, I believe, sells these. Pretty easy on a thin metal because you're just making a hole and that's the point of it. But I have also made one on my transmission pan, which I had to thread holes for. The oil pan does have an Alaska pad or a heating pad, which you can heat the oil up, which isn't really necessary, but if you really wanted to be like a stickler and have your engine oil at like 100 degrees Fahrenheit before you start it, you could technically do that. So that's the block and the pan. So moving from the bottom up, it has a crank scraper. It originally had a girdle and a windage tray, but I had to sell that and I didn't want to run ARP studs and run the risk of having too much clamp force and having to get it realigned home because it wasn't in my budget. But I did keep the crank scraper, which crank scraper, it's still great for oil control. And at those mid to higher level RPMs, as you will get a little power increase, like something like 3% on a build like this, which, it could be like 5-10 horsepower, something like that. So why not, right? And they're cheap enough to just throw on there. And then you throw some silicone in between the gasket and the block to make sure it's sealed. From there, so I got a good deal on a forged crank. It is the 3.4 stroke, so this is a regular stroke 306 with, like I said, a 4 and 30 thousandths bore. It could have easily turned into a stroker like a 331 or 347. I kind of prefer the balance of a 302. And I like the thought of a littler engine in a giant vehicle. So from there, I took the 50-ounce balance that's factory with the trucks and luxury cars, and put it to the old 60s 302 balance. Now it's a 28-ounce balance. So the flex plate, the harmonic balancer, the crank, they've all been externally balanced. Excuse me. That was the only thing I didn't do myself. Obviously, is I don't have a son in or whatever to balance the crank out. But everything else, including the porting, was all done right here, all by myself. This was my first bottom up build. When I was a teen, I had worked and helped someone in their shop, and I had learned how to do like valve jobs on the old Black and Decker, and I helped build like a 351 Cleveland, which was pretty cool. But my first engine ever was something that a lot of people won't get to see with like canted valves and all that. So yeah, 28 ounce balance now, which there's a lot of debate. It's not that it makes more power, but between that, the roller rockers, and what valves I have, like it does, it's a little snappier of a rev. And with this, I have some gentle persuaders going behind this engine that I'll talk about in a bit, but with the smaller torque converter and that, so it won't quite sound like a typical truck engine, even though it doesn't make a difference in power. It's just a little snappier, that you can notice. So from there, it does have forged I-beam rods, which are actually out of a Ford Explorer. Those were actually reconditioned. You know, I always make sure the stuff that's going into this is decent. So those are again forged out of an Explorer. I'm pretty sure the ones even out of this were forged. Like all Ford rods are basically forged. You could have run a cast crank in this, but I got a good deal on it. So from there, it does have Federal Mogul or Speed Pro coated pistons that are regular old hypers. Cast piston. They were a balance set. I did drop one. I dinged one, so I had to replace one, and so now they're a little slightly mismatched, but the machinist was like, yeah, you'll be fine. So they're not enough out of weight or balance. So with a forged crank, one thing that you have to have, and by the way, I did that in case of forced induction, and then this was going to be a blower motor, and just budget wise, I had to switch back to NA. But one thing you have to make sure you do with forged material, because of the hardness of it, is you really have to run a tri-metal bearing that has a babbitt layer in case you ever break that oil film or barrier and come into contact. So it does have Mala Cleveite 77 bearings all around. The camshaft tunnel is also Cleveite 77, but they're molecular, which is technically like a bimetal. King Bearings does a lot with molecular, and those are also great bearings. But these are also known as the NASCAR bearings. So these are the same tri-metal like Babbitt that NASCAR runs. So from there, that's basically our short block. The main cap, so these 302s, the irons are just a 2-bolt. This one's well within its power limits, but it has they are running ARP bolts instead of studs now. So I can run the crank scraper and all still, but then from there, the heart of the whole system is our camshaft. For that, I went with a Lunati bare bones. To spec the cam card out, it's nicely under 500 thousandths, so it's a 472 thousandths and a 496. So it's a dual pattern rather than a single pattern. Like a lot of the Ford letter cams, you'll have the same lift points, which is kind of like questionable because obviously that exhaust valve, especially the stock E7, is relatively small, and you really want to scavenge that exhaust out of there. So having a bigger lift and stuff is better. The duration on this cam is relatively decent. On the advertise is like 281 to 293, so it's a decent duration. But the 50 thousandths, it's a little more modest. It's like a 215 224, so totally streetable. But it also gives it a perfect RPM range, so it's like 1500 to 5500. So good low and mid, but it does have that duration to help carry it up into the 5,000, so it doesn't cut off before then. So that's our camshaft. It's also a 112 lobe separation. angle, and it should work decently, with still using speed density. And there's some modifications there that I'll get into. So that's our camshaft. On top of our camshaft, we do have Lunati micro troll lifters. So rather than the typical snap rods over the plunger, they are running a stronger type of retainer, and they do pump up better. The springs are better. Um, so that's our lifters. From there, I guess I could get more into the valve train. Then I'll get into the porting because that's like a lot longer of it to explain. So from there, we do have a hardened push rod. They are actually a new old stock from Blue Racer, like a now defunct company, and they're called Wolverine was the line, but they're carbonitrided push rods. And I did that because they were the only ones I could really find with a stock length of like 6.776. Right. So what that means is when I did my roller rockers here, is that I really didn't have to use any shims for these pedestal rockers. So that was kind of nice to be able to get lash without messing around with shims and measurements. So the rest of the valve train, we do have a Lunati Voodoo spring. Off the top of my head, I can't remember like the seat pressure and everything like that, but they are matched with the cam and everything. Our roller rockers are kind of high end. They're probably the best you can get for a pedestal style head, but they're the Scorpions. They're not they make these in two different types. There's like racing and then there's endurance for boats, which I think are a little bit lighter. But basically they're a 1.6 ratio, so it changes nothing about our cam specs. So pretty standard stuff. And like I said, because of having the push rod length correct, they dialed in perfectly within 360 to 540 degrees, I think, is what you want once you have zero lash, or basically like you can kind of move the push rod around in the cup, but you can't, there's no play vertically for that. So that is the valve train, and that's technically some of the only internals that aren't Ford, is our Lunati and Scorpion equipment, and Blue Racer, obviously. Other than that, part of the pride of this engine, and we do have a couple aftermarket bolt-ons I'll get to, and obviously that distributor is not a Ford distributor, or Ford headers, etc. But what I'll get into, though, is the core of it all, though, is so everything on the top end, at least this intake and plenum, were what comes with a Ford truck. Okay. So E7s are truck heads, but they happen to also use them on Mustangs as well, which I always thought was pretty cool. So what it is this whole top end is ported. These E7s are probably one of the better port jobs that you'll see that I did myself, and I know that because I followed a lot of high-end mentorship, and I asked a lot of questions, did a lot of research, and I put my homework in, and I took my time. The heads probably took me about 40 hours. You add the plenum to that and the lower, like it's probably a good 100 hours worth of grinding and whatnot in these. And a lot of people will be like, oh, why'd you do that? Just buy AFRs. I don't have the money to, and there's something that to me is a lot cooler to be able to carve out your own performance. Like it's kind of like true hot rodding. So kind of the whole principle of this was taking the stock engine and seeing if we could like double the power, but also by keeping the cam relatively modest and under a 500 thousandths lift. It's like I said, the E7s don't really respond well after 500. It's not, you're getting diminishing returns compared to like porting a GT40 or even going with larger valves. Oh, that's the other thing. So the rest of the valve train, so they are also stainless steel valves. So aftermarket valves, they are back cut and undercut. They're a little bit lighter, so you get a little more rev out of that as well. They're better for higher RPM, even though this engine is under 6,000. But so that's the rest of it. They were just lapped in. Unfortunately, I didn't do like a 3-angle or anything crazy, but they were double leak tested. So they're leak tested with the regular weight of the valve, and then with the compressed weight attached to the spring with the retainers and everything. So, but yeah, the port job on this, a lot of time was taken to do it properly. Even the exhaust, a lot of thought and knowledge went into it. They, um, like the exhaust ports, for example, are close to stock because you want that exhaust to scavenge. You want more velocity that equals, torque. But the bowls are cut and biased toward the outside cylinder wall, or the point of travel from the center of cylinder. Okay, so that's how those were ported. The difference between doing it like that on the exhaust end versus hogging it out is like 20 foot-pounds. I've seen it dyno tested, so you don't want to go nuts on your exhaust side. And again, a lot of people think head porting is just the port exits and entries, and it isn't. Like, it's a lot of bowl work, tunnel work, etc. You can watch my other videos for all of that. On top of that, so the heads were the chambers were polished to help with brake specific fuel consumption, aka fuel economy. um, Outside of that, I am running, you can see I have my fiberglass spark plug and boot protectors. I do have E3s that I'm starting with, so I have a nice hot clean spark, so hopefully I have a nice efficient engine. These are like pretty thick sleeved ignition wires, like something like 10.5 millimeter or something. What's on top of that? Obviously an MSD Pro billet distributor. Also our timing chain is a true double roller with an Iwis chain, which are really great chains, German chains. What else? So this intake too, the lower intake, this was also completely ported out to the point where it's epoxy. So you open the tunnels and you straighten out that dog leg to the point where you blow a hole, and then it's epoxied over. So these front ones went from probably a measly 150 CFM, and now they're like well over 200, maybe like 220, 230 or so. This plenum, okay, moving around to the top. We are also running this is a 3/8 inch phenolic spacer, which is not really to lengthen the runners so much as just a potential heat barrier, because in a van doghouse, heat can be an issue. So out front, as far as, let's see, aftermarket bolt-ons, it does have BBK underdrive pulleys. This is a BBK dual 61 millimeter throttle body, which they also make like a 58. And this has been port matched to the plenum. This plenum also, these long runner plenums were obviously made for torque. Long runner equals velocity equals torque, right? So that's why they're on the trucks. I wanted a bit more RPM. I didn't want it to fall off at like 4,800 RPM. So this was cut open, and these ports were enlarged to be able to increase the CFM at a higher RPM. So now this thing cut open and it's port matched to the lower